In the harbor kingdom of Brenwatch, where the watchtowers burned all night against pirates and the great folk trusted a sword sooner than a word, there was a thing the guards said to each other on the long, cold watches: a running figure in the dark is guilty until the light says otherwise. It meant that suspicion was the safe wager, that a thing fleeing was a thing with reason to flee, and that in a dangerous world the prudent man struck first at the shape in the shadows and asked its name afterward. It was the creed of a kingdom that had been raided too often, betrayed too many times. A creed that had kept Brenwatch alive through hard years, and had also, the gentler souls murmured, hanged more than one innocent who'd merely had the bad luck to be moving fast in the wrong dark. Orla had never had the luxury of moving slow. A wolfless dock nurse, she tended the sick children of the harbor quarter. The fevered, the fitting, the ones the proper physicians would not cross the poor streets to see. And her work was often urgent and often by night. A small, wolfless woman hurrying through dark lanes with a child in her arms, racing a fever or a fit to the only help she could give. The guards knew her, mostly, and let her pass. But the great folk up the hill did not know her at all, and to them she was only ever what the creed declared her: a running figure in the dark, guilty until the light. She did not know that one night a sickness would sweep the upper town, and that the royal heir himself would fall to it, or that finding the child fitting and abandoned in a panic, she would do the only thing her whole life had trained her to do: snatch him up and run for help, or that the king of Brenwatch, seeing a wolfless stranger fleeing into the dark with his son in her arms, would draw his sword to cut down a kidnapper, and would freeze, blade raised, when he saw the child was not being stolen at all, but was crying and clinging in the arms of the only person in the palace who knew how to save his life. Chapter 1. The fever came up from the harbor that summer, the way sickness always did, and it did not care whose child it took. It started in the poor quarter, as such things do, and Orla had been fighting it there for a week. The choking fever that took the small ones fast, that turned to convulsions if it climbed too high, that she had learned, across years of dock nursing, to break with cold water and a steady hand, and the particular knowledge that the proper physicians, with their bleeding and their theories, had never bothered to learn because their patients could afford to die slowly. She had saved more harbor children than she could count. She had buried the ones she couldn't. She knew the fever the way a sailor knows a squall, by its smell, by its rhythm, by the exact moment it tipped from dangerous to deadly. But the fever did not stay in the poor quarter. It climbed the hill, as fevers do, carried on the breath of servants and traders, and it reached the upper town, and then the great houses, and then, though Orla did not yet know it, the palace itself, and the king's own son. She was called up the hill that night by a frantic servant, against all the usual order of things, because the upper town physician had a dozen great house children failing at once, and not hands enough. And someone had remembered that the dock nurse knew this fever better than any proper doctor, and pride had bent before panic. So Orla climbed to the upper town for the first time in her life, her satchel of cold cloths and bitter teas on her shoulder, and went house to house through the small hours, breaking fevers and children whose families would never have let her through the door in better times. And somewhere in that long, desperate night, moving from house to house as the servants directed her, she was sent, in the confusion, by a steward who knew only that there was a fitting child, and a nurse who could help, and no time to check anyone's rank, into the palace itself, to the royal nursery, to the heir of Brenwatch who had taken the fever worst of all and who was, when Orla reached him, alone. Chapter 2. The nursery was in chaos, and then, worse, it was empty. She came into it to find the child mid-convulsion, a boy of 3, burning, his small body arching and jerking in the grip of the fever fit she knew too well, the dangerous one, the one that killed if it wasn't stopped fast. And the room around him was deserted. The nurses, she would learn later, had fled in panic when the fitting began, some for help and some simply in terror, certain the heir was dying and unwilling to be the ones holding him when he did. The proper physician was 3 great houses away, drowning in failing children. There was no one. There was a convulsing royal heir alone in a grand room, minutes from death, and a wolfless dock nurse who had broken this exact fit 100 times in the harbor quarter. Orla did not stop to think about rank, or permission, or what it meant for a nobody to lay hands on the heir of the realm. The child was dying and she knew how to stop it, and that was the whole of the world in that moment. She dropped her satchel and snatched the boy up. You had to get them upright, get the airway clear, she knew the holds. And she worked over him with the hard, fast certainty of 100 harbor nights, cooling his burning skin, clearing his throat, holding his convulsing body in the precise way that kept him breathing through the fit, murmuring the low, steady stream of nothing words she used to keep herself calm. And the child anchored. And she knew, with the cold clarity of experience, that breaking the fit here was not enough. The fever was too high. It would climb again and fit again within the hour, and the next fit might be the one that killed him. She needed cold water, fast, more than the nursery's basin held. She needed the cold of the deep cellar cisterns the servant had mentioned, the only thing in the great hot palace cold enough to break a fever this high. And there was no one to fetch it, and no time to wait. So she did the only thing left to do. She gathered the fitting, burning child against her chest, and she ran. She ran out of the empty nursery with the heir of Brenwatch in her arms, down through the dark palace toward the cold cellars, a small wolfless stranger racing a fever through the corridors with the king's son clutched and convulsing against her. And she did not stop to find a guard or explain herself, because the child was dying and every second was a second, and explaining would take time the boy did not have. She did not see the king until she had nearly run into him. Chapter 3. He came around a corner of the dark corridor, with 2 guards at his back, King Cormac, the watch-wolf, hard and fast and bred to a kingdom that struck first at shapes in the dark, and he had been running too. Woken with the news that his son was fitting and dying, racing to the nursery with terror driving him. And what he saw, in the torchlit dark of the corridor, was this: a wolfless stranger he had never seen, fleeing through his palace at a dead run, with his convulsing son clutched against her chest, carrying the heir of Brenwatch away into the dark. The creed of his whole kingdom rose in him faster than thought. A running figure in the dark is guilty. A stranger fleeing with the heir is stealing the heir. And the king of Brenwatch did the thing his kingdom's hard creed had bred into his blood. He drew his sword in a single ringing motion and put himself in her path, blade leveled at the kidnapper carrying off his son. "Put him down," Cormac said, and his voice was death. "Put down my son and step back, or I cut you where you stand." Orla skidded to a halt, the burning child convulsing in her arms, the king's sword a hand's breadth from her, and her heart slammed, but the child was dying, and that was larger than the blade. "My lord, I can't put him down," she said, fast, desperate, not stepping back. "He's fitting. If I lay him flat, he'll choke. If I stop holding him right, he'll stop breathing. My lord, he's not being stolen, he's being saved. I'm the dock nurse they called up the hill. The nursery was empty, he was convulsing alone. There was no one. I have to get him to the cold cisterns. The fever's too high. It'll climb again and kill him within the hour if I don't break it cold. Please, my lord. Every second you point that sword at me is a second he doesn't have." Liar. The blade did not waver. Cormac's face was a mask of terror and fury, and the creed had its hooks in him too deep to release on a stranger's word. "A wolfless nobody runs through my palace with my fitting son and calls it saving. You're stealing him in the chaos, taking the air while the fever empties the nursery. Put him down." And Orla, with the sword at her throat and the dying child in her arms, did the only thing left. She turned, slightly, so the torchlight fell full on the boy she carried, so the king could see him. Not see a bundle being carried off. See his son. See the child's face. And Cormac saw. Chapter 4. He saw his son's face, and his son was not limp, not drugged, not being carried off insensible the way a stolen child would be. His son was crying, conscious between the fits, burning and terrified and crying not to be put down, not to escape the stranger, but clinging to her, his small fists locked in her dress, his fevered face turned into her neck, reaching for the wolfless dock nurse the way a frightened sick child reaches for the one person who is helping it. The child was not being kidnapped, the child was holding on. And the king of Brenwatch froze, his sword raised, his whole body locked, as the thing he was seeing overrode the creed that had drawn his blade. A stolen child fights or hangs limp. A stolen child does not cling, sobbing, to the thief. His son was crying into this stranger, gripping her, comforted by her even in the grip of the fever, and the boy's small hand, when the king froze before them, did not reach for his own father. It clutched tighter to the dock nurse. "He's clinging to you," Cormac said, and his voice had changed, the fury draining into a horrified bewilderment. "My son he's holding you, not fighting, not reaching for me, he's..." The sword sank, an inch, two. What did you— I broke his fit, my lord, Orla said, quiet and fast and steady. The child convulsing again now, a smaller tremor, against her chest. Twice now since I found him. He clings because I'm the one keeping him breathing. Sick children hold to whoever's helping them, it's instinct. It's the only safe thing they know in the middle of the terror. He doesn't know you can't save him from this, and I can. He only knows whose arms make the fitting stop. She was already moving again, edging past the lowered blade, because the child could not wait for the king to finish understanding. And he's going to fit again, harder, and I have to get him cold now or your kingdom loses its heir while you stand here deciding whether I'm a thief. So put up your sword and follow me, my lord, or get out of my way. But for the love of anything, don't make me explain myself one more second while your son is dying in my arms. Sheathed his sword and followed the dock nurse at a run toward the cold cellars, because his own son's crying, clinging body had told him a truth louder than the creed of his whole kingdom. Chapter 5. They broke the fever in the cold cisterns, the king and the dock nurse together, in the long, terrible hour before dawn. Orla worked over the child with the hard certainty of 100 harbor nights, cold water and cold cloths and the steady holds that kept him breathing through each climbing fit, and the king beside her, doing what she told him, a hard, proud man taking orders from a wolfless nobody, because she was the only one in the palace who knew how, fetching and holding and cooling at her sharp commands, his terror channeled into use. The fever climbed and crested, and at last, somewhere in the gray before dawn, with the child limp and exhausted, but breathing, the fits finally stilled, the burning skin gone cool. It broke. The boy slept, truly slept, the deep, clean sleep of a child past the crisis. His fever gone, his small body finally at rest. He would live. Orla knew it the way she knew weather. She had seen this exact recovery 100 times in the harbor quarter, and she let herself, for the first time since she'd entered the nursery, breathe. The king knelt by his sleeping son in the cold cellar, and put his face in his hands, and the watchwolf, who had drawn a sword to cut down the woman who'd saved the boy, shook, silently, with the aftermath of a terror that had nearly cost him everything. When he looked up at Orla, his hard face was wrecked, and his eyes were full of the things she'd seen the moment his sword sank, the horror of a man who understands what he nearly did. I almost killed you, Cormac said, rough. You ran through my palace saving my son's life, and I drew steel to cut you down for a kidnapper. And if you'd been a half-second slower turning him to the light, if I'd struck before I saw his face, he could not finish it. My son would be dead. The only person in this palace who could save him, cut down in a corridor by his own father, because she had the misfortune to be a wolfless stranger running in the dark. His voice broke. That is the creed of my whole kingdom. A running figure in the dark is guilty until the light. I have lived by it. I have ruled by it, and it nearly made me murder the woman saving my child. You stopped, my lord, Orla said quietly, exhausted, the sleeping child still warm against her. That's the thing. The creed had the sword in your hand, but you looked. You let the light say otherwise before you struck. Most who live by that creed don't. They strike first and call the dead body proof they were right to. She looked down at the sleeping boy. I've buried children in the harbor quarter that a guard's sword took for running in the dark, when they were only running for help. The creed kills the innocent more than it catches the guilty, my lord. But you stopped. You looked at your son's face instead of my running shape. That's rarer than you know. Chapter 6. He kept her, after, and not, this time, as a prisoner to be questioned, but as something the palace could not do without, for the fever did not pass with the heir's recovery. It raged through the upper town for weeks, and the proper physicians, with their bleeding and their theories, lost child after child, while the wolfless dock nurse who knew the fever's true rhythm broke fits and brought down fevers and saved great house children whose families had laughed at the harbor quarter a month before. The king, who had watched her save his son with knowledge no proper physician possessed, set her at the head of the fight over the appalled objections of the upper town doctors, because he had learned, at sword's point, in a dark corridor, exactly what it cost to trust the creed of rank over the evidence of his own eyes. And he came to find her, in the evenings, in the sick rooms or the nursery where his son was healing. because the night in the corridor had cracked something open in him that the hard creed of his kingdom had packed down hard. She learned him sideways in the lamplit sick rooms, that he was a man bred to suspicion, taught from boyhood that a king who trusted slowly lived and a king who trusted fast died, in a kingdom raided and betrayed too often to afford the benefit of the doubt, that the creed had kept Brenwatch alive through hard years, and had also made it a hard, cold, fearful place, where the prudent struck first and the innocent paid for it, and where the king himself had nearly murdered the savior of his own line, that he had ruled 3 years by that creed, and been beneath the hardness, deeply alone, because a man who trusts no one until the light proves them safe is a man who is always finally alone in the dark with his sword. "You're not a cruel man, my lord," Orla said one night, watching him sit by his healing son. "You're a frightened one. Your whole kingdom is. You've been raided and betrayed so often you've made suspicion into a virtue. Strike first, trust never, guilty, until the light. And it's kept you alive, but it nearly killed your son, my lord, because the creed doesn't know the difference between a thief and a nurse running for help. It only knows the running. And a kingdom that strikes first at every shape in the dark spends its whole life cutting down the people running toward it to help." She looked at the sleeping boy. "Your son clung to me because a sick child trusts whoever helps it fast, on instinct, without checking their rank first. Children are the only honest part of your kingdom, my lord. They haven't learned the creed yet. They still reach for the helping hand instead of the highborn one. Maybe there's something in that worth more than suspicion." Chapter 7. The almost came on a clear night, after the fever had finally passed and the air was whole and running about the nursery again, and the dock nurse who had saved him and 100 others had become, to the baffled resentment of the upper town, a fixture of the palace. The king found her in the nursery, watching his recovered son play, and he said, "Stay. My lord, the fever's past. The harbor quarter will need me back. There's always sickness down there, and no one else to tend it. That's not what I mean, and you know it." He turned. The hardness, the creed, all of it gone from his face. "I'd make you my queen, Orla, not because you saved my son, though you did, twice over, when my own sword would have stopped you. For the woman who ran through a palace full of strangers with a dying child, knowing exactly what a wolfless figure running in the dark would look like to a kingdom like mine, and ran anyway, because the child was worth more than her own life." His hand rose to her jaw. "I drew steel to cut you down, and you didn't even break stride. You turned my son to the light so I could see, and saved him while I was still deciding whether to kill you. You showed me what my whole kingdom's creed costs. Marry me, help me unlearn the suspicion that nearly murdered the woman saving my heir." The yes rose in her like the broken fever, and behind it, the old hard arithmetic. A wolfless dock nurse, a harbor quarter nobody, a king whose whole kingdom runs on suspicion of exactly people like you. The moment you set foot in that hall as queen, you're the running figure in the dark made permanent, the stranger they nearly cut down, raised above them, and every guard and lord bred to the creed will see you as the thing the creed warns against. They'll never trust you. They'll spend their lives waiting for the light to prove you guilty, because that's the only way they know to look at a wolfless nobody who came running out of the dark. You saved his son. That doesn't make you safe. It makes you the shape the whole kingdom was trained to strike at, standing where the queen should stand. "I can't," she whispered. "Cormac, my lord, don't you see what I am to your kingdom? The running figure in the dark. The wolfless stranger you nearly cut down. If you raise me to queen, your whole court, bred to suspect exactly what I am, will never stop waiting for the light to prove me guilty. They'll see the dock nurse who appeared from nowhere with the air in her arms, and they'll whisper that I engineered it, that I made him sick to save him, that I'm a schemer who ran a long game to a throne. The creed will turn everything I did into proof against me. You stopped your sword once, my lord. Your court won't. They'll spend your whole reign with their blades half drawn at the shape that came running out of the dark." She stepped back. "Let me go back to the harbor, my lord. Let me tend the sick where I'm needed and overlooked. It's safer. A dock nurse who saved the heir is a story they'll tell kindly. A queen who came running out of the dark is a sword they'll never quite sheath. That was the worst of it, for 3 days." Chapter 8. On the 3rd day, the creed came for her, and it came, as she'd feared, with a blade half drawn. It was the captain of the king's watch, Lord Bran, the keeper of Brenwatch's hard creed, the man whose whole life was suspicion made into duty, who had heard that his king meant to raise the wolfless Dockners to the throne, and had concluded, with the cold certainty of a man trained to strike first, that the kingdom was being taken by a long and patient enemy. He came to the nursery with 2 of his watchmen, and a writ and the creed in his eyes, and he found Orla there with the recovered child. "Your Majesty," Bran said, loud, "for his men and for the watching household. I come in love of Brenwatch, which your fathers built on the one truth that has kept us alive when softer kingdoms fell. A figure in the dark is guilty until the light. Trust never. Strike first. It is the creed of the Watch and the foundation of this kingdom's survival." His gaze raked Orla cold and certain. "And you would raise to the throne the very thing that creed warns against. A wolfless stranger who appeared from nowhere with the heir dying in her arms. Convenient, Majesty, was it not? The nursery empty, the nurses fled, and only she on hand to save him. The Watch has seen such long games before. Make a child sick, save him in the eyes of a grateful father, and ride that gratitude to a throne. It is the oldest infiltration there is." He turned to the king. "It cannot stand, Majesty. Send the dock nurse back to her harbor under guard, and let the Watch investigate how the heir came to fall sick, and the nursery to empty at the precise moment a wolfless stranger was on hand. The creed has kept us alive 100 years. Do not abandon it for a pretty story and a saved child. Strike first, Majesty. You can mourn the mistake later if you're wrong. You cannot undie if you're right." And the captain reached to take Orla by the arm, to lead the running figure out of the light and into the Watch's dark cells. And the child, the recovered heir, who had been playing at their feet, looked up and saw the watchman's hand reaching for the woman who'd saved him, and he flung himself between them, wrapping his arms around Orla's legs, and screamed at the captain with the whole honest force of the very young. "No, she's mine." She made it stop hurting. The captain's hand stopped, and the king had gone silent, watching his son cling to the dock nurse. But it was not the king in the end who finished it. It was Orla who gathered the child against her and faced Lord Bran and the hard creed of the whole kingdom, and spoke with no armor left at all. "You want to strike first, my lord captain," she said, her voice shaking and climbing and holding. "Guilty until the light. It's kept Brenwatch alive, you say, and you're not wrong. A kingdom raided as often as yours learned hard caution for hard reasons." She held the child close, and he quieted, gripping her. "But you've never once counted what the creed costs, my lord, because the cost is always paid by people too low for the Watch to mourn. I'm a dock nurse. Do you know how many harbor children I've buried that a watchman's sword took for running in the dark? Running for help? Running for a physician? Running from a fire? Cut down because a figure running in the dark is guilty until the light. And the light came too late?" She faced the captain full on. "Your king drew his sword on me in a corridor 3 weeks past. I was running through this palace with his son fitting in my arms, racing a fever to the cold cisterns, and the creed of your whole kingdom put a blade at my throat for it, for saving the heir. And do you know why your king's son is alive right now to cling to my legs? Because the king stopped. Because he let the light say otherwise before he struck. Because for once, a man bred to your creed looked at the running figure's face instead of just the running, and saw a dying child being saved, not a kidnapper fleeing." Her voice broke and held. "That's the whole difference, my lord. The creed says strike first and you'll be right often enough to survive. But every time you're wrong, the cost is someone like me, running toward you to help, cut down in the dark. You'd have me investigated as an infiltrator for the crime of being a wolfless nobody who appeared with a sick child. But I didn't appear from nowhere. Your own steward sent me, in the chaos, because I'm the only soul in this kingdom who knows that fever. Check it. Let the light say otherwise. That's the one part of your creed worth keeping, my lord. Not the striking first, but the looking. And you've forgotten it, because looking takes a moment, and the creed taught you that the prudent man doesn't spare the moment." She turned to the king, and the brave, reckless thing tore loose. "You asked me to be your queen," she said, "and I said no, because I was afraid your kingdom would never stop seeing me as the figure that came running out of the dark, guilty until a light that never comes. And here's your captain, exactly as I feared, with his hand already reaching for me." Her eyes streamed and she let them. "So I was wrong. Not about what the creed would say, about whether you'd let it have me. You stopped your sword in the corridor. You can stop your watch in this nursery. You don't have to live by strike first. You proved that the night you looked at your son's face. So, yes, if you'll have the running figure for a queen, in front of the captain who'd cut her down, yes, and not to hide in the harbor where the Creed can't see me. To stand where the whole kingdom can, and be the proof that the figure running out of the dark is sometimes running to you, and that a king who looks before he strikes saves more than he ever loses. The king stepped to her side, and the cold that came off the watch wolf was a thing his captain had never seen turned on the Creed itself. "You'll not take her, Bran," Cormac said, and there was the watch's hardness in it but a clearer thing under it. "And you'll not investigate the woman who saved my son as an infiltrator. Look at my boy. He stands between her and your hand and screams that she's his, that she made it stop hurting. And he's right, and he's the only one in this room who never learned to strike first at a stranger." He looked at the captain, and something in his hard face reached for the hard man's. "The Creed kept us alive, Bran. I'll not throw it away. Caution is a true thing, and the watch is right to look hard at the dark. But you've taken strike first and forgotten let the light say otherwise, and the two were always meant to go together. I nearly murdered the savior of my line because I'd forgotten the second half. The Creed's not strike, it's look, then judge, and the looking is the part that keeps us from becoming the thing the raiders are. She came running out of the dark, and I looked, and the light said savior, not thief. That's the Creed working as it should, and you'd undo it, and strike first, and lose us the best thing that ever ran into this palace out of the night. And Lord Bran, looking at the air clinging to the dock nurse's legs, and screaming that she was his hand still half-reaching, the Creed warring in him with the evidence of his own eyes, slowly lowered his hand and bowed his head, because a watchman whose whole creed includes, let the light say otherwise cannot, when the light has plainly spoken, go on pretending it is dark. Epilogue. 1 year later, the watchtowers of Brenwatch still burned all night against the pirates, and the watch still looked hard at the shapes in the dark. But they looked now, before they struck, and the kingdom had not fallen for the looking. And a great many innocents who'd merely been running for help in the dark were alive who would not have been. For the Creed had changed in that hard harbor kingdom. Strike first had been tempered back into the older, truer thing the king had remembered, at sword's point. Look, then judge. Let the light say otherwise before you strike. The watch had hated it at first, the way hard men hate any softening of a creed that had kept them alive. But they had all heard the story by now. How the king had nearly cut down the savior of his heir, and stopped, and looked, and seen the truth in a child's clinging arms. And they had learned slowly that the looking cost a moment and saved more than it ever lost. That had scandalized the kingdom most. A wolfless dock nurse raised to queen, the very figure their creed was built to suspect, who still went down to the harbor quarter to tend the sick with her own hands, who had made the looking before the striking a pillar of the rain. They had stopped, eventually, waiting for the light to prove her guilty. They had not settled on what came after. The queen who came running, the harbor folk said, the poor of the dock quarter, who had watched one of their own run into the palace dark with a dying child and come out its queen. And Orla thought that would do. The boy, the heir, grew sturdy and whole and unafraid, and had never quite let go of his dock nurse, who had appeared out of the chaos when he was burning and dying, and made it stop hurting, and who turned out, to his great satisfaction, to be staying. Lord Bran, his creed tempered, had become, having nearly arrested the savior of the line, one of the fiercest teachers of the new watch, drilling his men in the half of the creed they'd forgotten, because he above any knew what striking first had nearly cost. Cormac came down to the harbor quarter on a clear evening, to the docks where her work was, because some things are worth keeping the shape of, and his queen would not give up tending the sick. He found her in a fever room, a harbor child cooling in her hands, the worst of its crisis broken, the boy's poor mother weeping her thanks. In his hand the king carried something small, the very satchel she'd dropped in the nursery the night she'd saved his son, the dock nurse's bag of cold cloths and bitter teas, which he'd had cleaned and kept. "I kept this," he said, when the fever child was sleeping and they stood in the lamplit harbor dusk. "The bag you dropped to catch my son when he was fitting." Everyone in Brenwatch believed the safest thing a kingdom could do was strike first. Suspect the dark, trust no one, cut down the running shape before it could cut you. He pressed the worn satchel into her hands, and the creed kept us alive, it's true. but it nearly killed the one person running toward us in the dark with everything we couldn't afford to lose. The most dangerous figure in my kingdom that night wasn't the wolfless stranger fleeing through my palace. It was me, with my sword drawn, ruling by a creed that had forgotten how to look. His mouth found her hair. "I thought you were stealing my son." And then I saw him crying in your arms, clinging, not fleeing, and the truth was louder than the creed of my whole kingdom. The most valuable thing in Brenwatch wasn't behind my watchtowers, Orla. It was a dock nurse running out of the dark with my son's life in her hands, whom my own sword nearly cut down for the crime of running. Orla laughed, the easy whole sound that came so freely now, and slung the worn satchel back over her shoulder, where it belonged, kept like every life she'd ever run through the dark to save. The watchtowers burned along the harbor against the night, looking now before they struck, and the kingdom that had nearly murdered its own salvation slept the safer for it. And the wolfless dock nurse who had run out of the dark with a dying child, and been taken for a kidnapper and proven by a boy's crying, clinging arms to be the opposite, tended the sick of the harbor still, running toward the helpless in the dark, as she always had, no longer guilty until the light, but trusted at last because a king had remembered to look before he struck. It was the only creed she had ever lived by, to run toward the dying thing in the dark, whatever it cost, whatever it looked like to those who'd only ever learned to strike first. And it had, in the end, saved an heir and tempered a kingdom, and been worth a crown.